I think most people have probably heard of the Great Fire of London that took place in 1666. The number of the beast plus 1,000. But I don't think many people have heard of the Great Fire of Glasgow that took place in 1652. So we had a Great Fire first, before them. Glasgow wasn't as big as it is now, but nevertheless about a third of the city was burnt to the ground. And it occupied a pretty big area, Gallowgate, Salt Market and the Trongate behind me. And something like 1,000 families were made homeless.
At that time, Glasgow did not have a fire service, and clearly the disastrous effect of this blaze got people thinking that buckets of water were perhaps no longer cutting it. So 5 years later, in 1657, the city got its first fire engine. And they certainly needed it, because just 20 years later, yet another great fire broke out in which 136 houses and shops were destroyed, 600 or 700 families were made homeless, and the tall booth clock caught fire. Fast forward some 200 years when, in 1851, Glasgow got its first purpose-built fire station. But even at this date, the city's fire brigade was under the control of Glasgow Police, and it wasn't until 1891 that it became an independent force. Here's some firemen outside their College Street station around 1890.
That's College Street, just over there. It takes its name from the college that used to sit in the High Street. I think the street actually led directly to the main entrance of the college. And of course that college is now Glasgow University on Gilmour Hill. The College Street used to be longer than it is now. At one time, just where it stops there used to be a bend, a slight bend, and then it carried on to Albion Street, then called, or this part of it I think was called North Albion Street. And it was in that additional part that no longer exists that Glasgow's first purpose-built fire station, the central fire station, was built in 1851. You can in fact see the details in that fire station in Ordnance Survey's first town plan dating to 1857.
Glasgow's had a few big fires over the centuries, and probably more than one great one. If we search for the word fire in the People's History of Glasgow by John K. Dowell, dating to 1899, we find a few fires mentioned. In addition to the worst Great Fire of 1652, there were other great fires in 1600 and 1677. Indeed, according to that same source, between 1875 and 1898, Glasgow had 26 great fires, although their definition of great was for fires where damage caused was more than £20,000, maybe something like over £3 million today. And some of the premises affected caught fire more than once during that period. According to this source, the Theatre Royal in Cowcaddens caught fire in 1879 and in 1895. And even today, in Glasgow, some buildings catch fire more than once, the Glasgow School of Art being but one example. For fires that were perhaps not just as great from a financial point of view, there were other fires involving loss of life and property. 2 people died in a fire in the Salt Market in 1748, and in the following year 150 families in the Gorbals were made homeless due to a fire. There are many other examples over the years, but in 1898 we see the first deaths of firemen in the city. 4 firemen were killed fighting a fire in a chemical warehouse in Renfield Street. Glasgow's had a lot of fires over the years. Of course, a major factor in many of those early fires was that most of the buildings were made from wood, and many with thatched roofs. This woodcut shows close number 77 off the Salt Market in 1849. I mean, we can see stone buildings, but most are just stone in the ground floor with wooden construction in upper floors.
Well, just behind me in Ingram Street was Glasgow's second main fire station. Although it's retail premises and housing now, it does at least still look as if at one time it was a fire station. It was built in 1900 to replace the one in College Street, which just sat there, and was in use by the fire brigade up until 1986. It was the headquarters of Glasgow Fire Brigade between 1900 and 1975, when the Glasgow Fire Brigade then became part of Strathclyde Fire Brigade. It was actually the last fire station that was built that was able to accommodate horse-drawn fire engines.
As the city expanded into surrounding areas like Springburn, Partick and Govan, more and more fire stations came under the control of the Glasgow Fire Brigade. Add to this the construction of more fire stations in the city itself, along with smaller substations, and the number of firemen grew proportionately from around 121 in 1892 to something like 2,500 in 1975. That number made up of full-time firemen and retained firefighters, or men who volunteered and were able to be called up in any emergency. One of the smaller substations was this one in St Enoch Square, captured in the 1890s.
Well, that's Partick's station just behind me. Built in 1905 to replace an earlier one that was in Anderson Street. And you know, these days, although it's now housing, it still looks like it was a fire station at some time, with big words saying Partick Fire Brigade Station. And I think probably what's fairly unique is behind it. We can't see it from here. There's a tall brick tower that I imagine, and I'm pretty certain was a watchtower. And I dare say you would have had guys up there, perhaps in shifts, 24 hours a day, I'm guessing, to keep a lookout for any fires that might break out. Or even if there was reports of a fire, you could head up there and just see how big that fire was. But not all of these buildings that were fire stations, they don't all look like fire stations these days.
Here we see Partick's firemen around 1900.
And here in Orkney Place in Govan is an example of a building that you would, in looking at it, you would never know that part of it used to be a fire station. The tenement just behind me. The building was constructed in 1898, and the fire station that was part of it was built to replace an earlier one, which I think was just round the corner on Orkney Street here. Probably part of the police station that was there. And it's only when we look at a photograph dating to the 1920s or 30s that we can see exactly what was going on here. I mean, when you look at it just now, there's obviously some changes in the stonework. There's an orange colour there which doesn't look natural, and that's exactly where the old fire station used to be. Well, just behind me is the Southern District Fire Station, built in 1916. It's really a rather stout looking building. It's the sort of construction that looks as if it lasts forever. I don't know what it's been used for just now. It has a slightly derelict and unoccupied look about it, but it is good to see that the building's still standing. And we can see some of the fire crew in a photograph dating to 1924. And in addition to that solid construction, if you just look, there are one or two little carved bits of stone, and occupying a central position just below the roof is a carving of a fireman's helmet and fireman's equipment. It's just a small but a really nice detail. And you know, when I was checking up on this building in Google Street View, and I'll show you, I took a screenshot of it, and you'll see it just now. I think it's an indication of just how many fires Glasgow has had and continues to have. Because the building on the corner, just opposite this fire station, the other side of Centre Street, is clearly showing the after effects of a fairly big fire. Not so much when I look at it now, but certainly in that Google Street View image, it shows a big fire. In this area in Tradeston, this south of the River Clyde, has had an alarming number of fires in recent years. And none more so than the tragic fire in Kilbirnie Street.
In August 1972, a fire broke out in a warehouse in Kilbirnie Street. Apparently, a fluorescent light bulb exploded, starting a small fire that turned into a catastrophic blaze. While fighting the fire, a fireman became trapped inside. 6 firemen entered the building to rescue him, but sadly all 7 perished in the blaze. This wasn't the only major fire in a warehouse owned by the Sher brothers. Of all the major fires in Glasgow, one of the worst was in Cheapside Street in 1960. Again, a warehouse was involved, but in this case it was a bonded warehouse full of 1 million gallons of whiskey and 30,000 gallons of rum. In what came to be described as the worst peacetime fire in British history, every fire engine in the city was called to fight the fire, along with others from outside the city. While fighting the fire, there was a massive explosion which blew out the front of the warehouse, sending rubble crashing into Cheapside Street and Warwick Street, where firemen and salvage crews were located. 19 men lost their lives. Another major fire occurred in James Watt Street in 1968. In this case, it wasn't firemen who lost their lives, but workers in a furniture factory who were unable to get out because of locked fire exits and metal bars on windows. 22 people perished in the blaze. The building no longer exists. It was located on the left of this doorway, which you can see in this photo of the blaze. As you wander around Glasgow, admiring all the nice old buildings, in most cases you don't really know the past of that building. And that's certainly the case, that kind of whitish building behind me in Renfield Street. Yeah, I've always admired it. It kind of stands out from the crowd, as it were. It's kind of whitish, and that in itself, I think, makes it stand out from the red sandstone of other buildings in Glasgow. And that sort of arch above the entrance. And as I say, you would never know when looking at these buildings, but in actual fact, at one time that was the classic cinema. I'll show you a photograph of it just now. And that cinema was gutted by fire, and I think it was the 1980s. I'll put a date on the screen if I'm kind of way out here. And I think it's probably just the facade of that original building that's left. I don't know if it's the whole facade or maybe just part of the facade. For some reason, the bit above the arch has a slightly different colour to it, but that's just maybe the dirt at street level that's making the ground level look a bit kind of duller. But yeah, another of Glasgow's fires. Another surviving example can be found in Buchanan Street. This photo shows the ruined aftermath of a fire in 1887. At that time, McDougall and Sons was a wholesale glass and china merchants. Clearly, the building has been gutted, with only the facade remaining, a facade on the ground and first floors that still remain to this day. The men in the old photo are salvagemen from the Glasgow Salvage Corps, who worked closely with the fire brigade in saving any goods not totally destroyed. They also inspected buildings to identify potential fire risks. here's some members of the Glasgow Salvage Corps at their headquarters in Ingram Street in 1891. Theatres were particularly prone to catching fire. If you visit the Panopticon Theatre in Glasgow today, it's now a visitor attraction, you'll see sections of burnt wood to the side of the stage, the aftermath of a fire in 1922. Then there's the City Theatre that once sat in Jail Square. That was destroyed by fire in 1845, just 5 months after it opened. And the Metropole Theatre, once known as the Scotia Music Hall in Stockwell Street, beside the Scotia Bar, was gutted by fire in 1961. You can see the entrance and fire-ravaged ruins in this 1960s photo. If we return to John K. McDowell's The People's History of Glasgow, we find other theatres that have caught fire, like the Dunlop Street Theatre, which burned in 1863. But there have been disasters where there was no fire, merely a suggestion of there being a fire, where the resultant panic caused multiple deaths. In the previously mentioned Dunlop Street Theatre, during a performance of the surrender of Calais, someone shouted fire, perhaps maliciously. There was no fire, but in the efforts to get out and the stampede that followed, 65 people were trampled to death. A similar thing happened in the Star Music Hall in 1884, where once again a false cry of fire sent everyone rushing for the exits, and in the panic 14 people died. Sadly, these are not unique events. In the Glen Cinema in Paisley in 1929, a shout of fire caused a panic that saw 71 children die in the crush. In this case, there was actually a little smoke from a film canister, but most deaths came about due to the fact that the fire exits were locked so as to prevent kids sneaking in to see the film, in this case, a cowboy film. There's no getting away from the fact that Glasgow's had a lot of fires, and I think we can all remember fires in the city in our lifetime. But there were probably more fires in the past, due to a lack of the rules and regulations that we have today, that were accrued from hard lessons learned from past fires. Buchanan Street, 1883. Fleming Street, 1886. Miller Street, 1891. College Street, 1891. Mitchell Street, 1892. East Howard Street, 1898. Dunlop Street, 1898. Renfield Street, 1898. Robertson Street, 1900. The Kelvin Hall on Dumbarton Road, 1925. Stobcross Quay, 1953. Berkeley Street, 1962. Great Western Road, 1972. Glasgow School of Art, 2014.
As you may have noticed, Glasgow has a river running through it, the River Clyde. And in the same way that there were fires in theatres and warehouses and other buildings, so too were there fires on ships in the River Clyde. This photo dates to 1940 during the Second World War, and it shows HMS Sussex on the fire after being hit by a 250-pound bomb just a little further downriver at York Hill. And one of the city's ferries is tackling the blaze. But there have been other fires on the River Clyde. As you wander the streets of Glasgow, looking up at the fine architecture, remember to look down as well, because in various locations in the city, on the pavement, you'll find plaques like this. It's part of the Firefighters Heritage Trail, and each plaque marks the location of a fire in which a fireman or firemen have died. This is right beside the River Clyde at the Science Centre, and it remembers Station Officer Douglas Mearns, who died in the ship's hold while fighting a fire on MV Page and Sand, just here. Yeah, Glasgow's had a lot of fires. I'm Eddie Burns. Take care.